The tower alarm hit at 3:17 in the morning, hard enough to rattle the steel frame of the outer door and set a tremor through the mug in my hand. By then I was already outside. That was the part I still couldn't make sit right in my head. The cold had teeth. Every breath burned the inside of my nose and left a dry chemical taste at the back of my throat. The air was so clean it felt sharp, like it had been filed down. Under my boots, the crusted snow over the service path gave a thin, glassy crackle. Ahead of me, the tower stood inside the spill of the perimeter lights, all red obstruction lamps and black lattice, moaning in the wind like old metal under strain. Except the wind wasn't blowing anymore. The station lights behind me hummed, the tower alarm screamed, and the ice at the base of the structure began to split in a pattern I knew too well. A circle of clean fractures shooting outward like spokes, neat and deliberate, the same geometry I'd once signed off as stable under storm load. I looked down, because I already knew where the next crack would go. It found the space between my boots. Then I heard another step behind me, close enough to feel the vibration through the frozen ground. I hadn't moved yet. I hadn't taken that step. But something behind me had put its foot down in the exact footprint I was only just about to make. I didn't turn around. I still don't know if that was the smartest thing I did that night or the reason it followed me out. It had started 4 days earlier when the supply aircraft left me alone at Frostline Station. And the first thing I noticed about Frostline was the sound. Not the wind, though there was plenty of that. A long metallic groan where it bent itself around the antenna arrays and guy lines. Not the engines from the ski plane lifting away either. What stayed with me was the hum, low and constant, like current running through the bones of the station. I felt it through the soles of my boots on the steel steps before I ever saw the place clearly. Frostline sat on Ellesmere Island, Nunavut, a compact weather station and relay facility raised on pilings above the drift line, with a single monitoring tower about 100 yards from the main structure. In summer it would have looked exposed, in winter it looked erased. White plain, white sky, white light. The only real edges were the perimeter lamps, the tower and the station itself, e.g. all angles and frost-rimmed seams. It was 42 kilometers from the nearest seasonal research outpost, farther than that from anything useful, which was part of why I liked these jobs. Remote stations were simple. Systems either worked or they didn't. You checked loads, monitored weather data, kept the generators happy, filed maintenance tickets, and tried not to make drama where none existed. I had spent years doing safety inspections across Arctic sites, radar installations, relay towers, weather platforms. I knew what cold did to metal, what wind did to anchors, how ice load lied to you until it didn't. By then I had a reputation for clean reports and quick turnarounds, which mattered in the North more than people admitted. Shutdown penalties cost money, delays cost contracts. And if you could keep a place open and keep the paperwork defensible, you stayed employed. Ingrid Solveig Thorsen met me in the airlock with a clipboard in one hand and a heat gun in the other. She was broad-shouldered, fair-haired, gone nearly white at the temples with that weathered look some Arctic people got, as if the cold had sanded away everything unnecessary. She didn't waste much movement. She pointed me to the boot tray, checked the seal behind me, and handed over the handover packet while the outer door finished locking. "Generator 2 is touchy in crosswind," she said. "Humidity sensor on the north rack drifts low after midnight. Main tower alarm is functional. Internal clock is the only time that matters, not your watch, not your phone, not the workstation unless you've synced it against the wall unit first." I took off my gloves and signed for the station. The paper was stiff with cold where she'd carried it in from the annex. "How bad's the drift?" I asked. "On the clocks?" "On anything." She looked at me for a moment, then nodded toward the far wall of the control room. That was where the rules were posted, laminated, printed in plain black block letters, 6 lines, each one short enough to remember. Do not exit the main station between 3 and 4. If you see movement beyond the perimeter lights, do not track it. Always confirm your position with the internal clock before responding to alarms. If the tower alarm sounds twice in 1 hour, do not investigate the second alarm. Keep all doors locked. If you find one unlocked, do not assume you opened it. And if you hear your own voice on the radio, do not answer. I read them once, then again, mostly because of the phrasing. Not safety language, not really. Safety language was precise and boring. This read like the cleaned-up version of a story told too many times. Ingrid watched my face while I read. Let me guess, I said. Someone had a long winter. Everyone has a long winter here. She said it flatly, not offended, not amused. Then she tapped the third rule with one gloved finger. Precision matters more than confidence at Frostline. If an alarm goes off, you verify time first, out loud if you need to. That happen often? Often enough. The hum under the floor seemed louder when neither of us spoke. I glanced toward the equipment racks. Status lights blinked green, then amber, then green again. And beyond the narrow triple-pane windows, the perimeter lamps made pale tunnels through blowing snow. I could smell machine oil, ozone, old coffee. I've run winter oversight before, I said. I can follow a procedure sheet. That should have ended it. It would have with most supervisors. Ingrid kept looking at me, measuring something. You're Callum Halverson, she said. I nodded. You did structural inspections before weather oversight. It wasn't a question. I felt a small tightening in my jaw that I hoped didn't show. A while back. Then you know that repeating a mistake doesn't make it less of one. There are moments even now that I go back over because they felt wrong before I understood why. That was one of them. Not because of what she said, but because of the way she said it. And as if we were already in the middle of a conversation I'd somehow missed the start of. I gave her a look that usually put an end to that kind of thing. If there's a point, make it. The point, she said, is that these aren't jokes. You can dismiss them if you want, but Frostline doesn't care whether you think it's being reasonable. That was the kind of sentence people said in isolated places when routine had curdled into superstition. I'd heard versions before. Special knocks, lucky routes, don't whistle in the battery shed, don't go near the old mast in freezing fog. Once people attached pattern to fear, they'd defend it harder than any actual protocol. So I did what competent men with too much confidence often do. I smiled, took the packet, and filed her under winter fatigued. The rest of the handover was straightforward. Fuel reserve levels, spare parts inventory, tower camera intermittent in heavy ice. Weather stable for the next 2 days, then a front moving down from the northwest. Ingrid was due out on the same aircraft that had brought me in. She walked me through the systems with brisk, exact language, and if her eyes kept drifting to the wall clock above the radio console, I chalked it up to a supervisor eager to leave. When she finally shouldered her bag, she stopped in the vestibule and looked back once. If you hear the tower at 3:17, she said, check the clock before you check the window. I frowned. Why 3:17? But she was already opening the inner hatch. The cold breathed in around her boots. The station hum deepened for a second like something listening. She didn't answer me. Looking back, and that was the last conversation I had with anyone who still belonged entirely to themselves. The first day passed cleanly. I ran diagnostics, cleared a blocked intake vent, synced the workstation clocks, tested the radio, and logged the usual battery of winter checks. Frostline rewarded routine. By evening, I was halfway relaxed, the way I always got when a site began resolving into systems instead of stories. Outside, darkness came early and never really left. Arctic night wasn't black. It was gradients, a blue-white smear off the snowfields, a dead silver shine on the drifts, the slow pulse of the tower beacons through spindrift. The cold thickened after supper. By 10, every time I cracked the inner hatch to dump waste heat into the service corridor, the air bit so hard it made my eyes water. I checked the station doors twice before midnight, more because of Ingrid's performance than because I thought it mattered. Main hatch secure. Rear maintenance hatch secure. South vestibule secure. I even tugged each handle after locking, feeling the resistance through my glove. The hum never stopped. That bothered me more than the rules did. I shut down the auxiliary rack for a relay calibration and still heard it low and electrical, somewhere under the floor or in the walls, like a transformer load with nowhere to go. I made a note to trace it in daylight. A little after 1, I took binoculars to the east window and scanned the tower line. Visibility was poor beyond the perimeter lamps. Snow devils moved across the drifts in flat, fast ribbons. The tower lights blinked red, then vanished behind a wall of white, then came back, in normal enough. At around 2 in the morning, I found the south vestibule door unlocked. That stopped me for exactly 3 seconds. The latch was fully open, not jammed, not sitting wrong, just open. I put my hand on it and felt the metal cold through the leather, colder than it should have been inside the station. The weather stripping sighed when I pressed the door inward a fraction. A hairline wedge of black showed at the seal before I pushed it shut again and reset the lock. I stood there with my hand still on the mechanism, replaying the earlier checks in my head. I'd locked it. I was certain of that. Then I did what I always did when certainty and embarrassment showed up together. I chose the explanation that made me look less foolish. Thermal contraction, distracted hand, incomplete seat. Pick one. I logged it as an isolated latch issue. At 2:48, something moved beyond the perimeter lights. Not crossed them, not approached. Moved beyond them, at the edge where the lamps turned snow into static, and everything outside that ring became guesswork. The first thing I picked up wasn't shape, it was absence. A patch where the blowing snow seemed to fall wrong, as if it were hitting something clear and splitting around it. Then came the sound, faint under the wind, a dry crunch at intervals too regular for drifting ice. I remembered the second rule and ignored it almost immediately. Binoculars lifted. Focus wheel turned. Breath held without my meaning to. At first I saw nothing but the grain of snowfall and the gray swell of open ground between the station and the farther drifts. Then the distortion sharpened. Footprints, only not being made. They were appearing one at a time in reverse order, the nearest impression smoothing over even as the next one farther out deepened, as if somebody invisible were walking backward away from the station while the snow corrected itself behind them. The spacing was human. The stride was human. I tracked the line farther out until the last visible mark dissolved into blowing white. I waited for consequence, a surge, a system fault, an impact on the walls. Something. Nothing happened. The tower lights kept blinking, the generator kept humming. My coffee went lukewarm on the console. After maybe 30 seconds, the distortion was gone and the plane outside looked empty again, flat and indifferent. I actually laughed once under my breath, and partly from nerves and partly from relief at having confirmed what I thought I had. Bad visibility, wind tricks, depth errors under flood lamps, exactly the sort of thing you got when exhausted people stared into snow too long and decided the landscape was stalking them. I made myself write it down in the log because that was the professional thing to do and because writing things down had a way of shrinking them. No anomaly confirmed, possible visual distortion beyond east perimeter during low visibility. No station impact, no further action required. I slept for 3 hours in my clothes and woke to the tower groaning in the wind and the wall clock reading 6:22. No blood. No missing time. No dead equipment. No proof that any of Ingrid's rules meant more than morale management for people wintering too far from other human beings. That was the first mistake the station let me keep. The second day was colder. The air outside had that dry metallic bite that made every breath feel thinner than it should have, and the tower cables sang under the wind with a pitch high enough to get into my teeth. I ran a full tower sensor sweep from inside and got clean returns. Ice load normal, vibration within tolerance, base temperature lower than forecast but acceptable. The sort of data that would have reassured anyone who still believed data and reality were always in the same room. Just after noon, I opened the station log to append the overnight notes and found an entry already sitting above my cursor. It was written in my style, and that sounds vague until you've spent enough years in technical reporting to recognize your own habits. Everybody has them. The kinds of abbreviations you trust, the order you list observations in, whether you write likely or probable, whether you soften a conclusion or drive it flat. This entry used my cadence, my phrasing, even my bad habit of starting corrective notes with confirmed. Confirmed tower base shear tone during external alarm sequence. Do not respond to second alarm. Radial ice spread at north footing matched prior stable pattern. Logged and verified. The timestamp was for 5:38 that evening. It was a little after noon. I sat very still with one hand on the trackpad, listening to the hum under the floorboards and the soft ticking of the wall clock over the radio. Then I checked the user credentials. Mine. I checked system access history, mine again. There was no sign of tampering, no remote session, no duplicate account usage. The verification line showed my authorization token and a workstation hash that matched the console in front of me. I deleted the entry. The screen froze for a second, blinked, and restored it. I deleted it again more carefully this time, then opened the raw log file. The entry remained. I could feel my own pulse in the pads of my fingers, not panic, irritation mostly. The kind you get when software behaves badly in a way that suggests it'll cost you hours of cleanup. I printed the file. The printer spat out the current page, and there it was on paper too, timestamp and all. At the bottom of the same sheet was another line that hadn't been on the screen a second earlier. Our south vestibule latch found unsecured, relocked. Do not assume you opened it. Logged and verified. That one made the skin along my arms tighten under my sweater. Because it wasn't new. It was the exact wording of the note I had nearly written the previous night before trimming it down. I stood up so fast the chair wheels clicked against the floor track. The room felt suddenly too warm, too small. I walked to the wall clock, checked it against my wristwatch, checked both against the workstation clock. They agreed within a few seconds. I even pulled the backup tablet from the charging dock and synced that too. Then I called Ingrid on the outpost frequency. Her response took long enough that I almost thought she wouldn't answer. When she did, her voice came through under a wash of static. Frostline. It's Halverson. I need to ask you something about the station software. A pause. Then, did you confirm the clock before calling? I stared at the radio handset in my grip. Yes. Another pause, shorter this time. Go on. I described the future entry without editorializing. Credentials mismatch. Preloaded maintenance text. Possible archive corruption. I kept it calm and professional. The way you spoke when you wanted another professional to stop playing games. Ingrid listened without interrupting. When I finished, I heard her exhale into the mic. Don't delete anything else, she said. If it predicts an event, do not try to get ahead of it. Follow the rules as posted. You're telling me this is normal. I'm telling you the station behaves consistently, if you let it. That's not an answer. It is the only useful one. The line crackled. For a moment, I thought I heard another sound under her voice, like paper shifting or someone breathing close to a microphone, but then it was gone. "I've got an entry here referencing a stable pattern," I said. "What prior pattern?" No reply. "Ingrid." When she answered, her voice had gone flatter. "If you want to leave Frostline with yourself intact, stop asking questions you think you already know the answer to." Then the transmission cut. I spent the next hour doing the sort of checks you do when you need the world to be mechanical again. Relay status, generator balance, tower telemetry, camera feeds, door contacts. Everything passed. The station was, on paper, healthy. At 5:32 that evening, and the tower emitted a low shear tone from outside, a drawn-out metallic complaint like structural stress under load. At 5:38, exactly as the future entry said, I saw on the external thermal feed that a narrow fan of darker cold had spread around the north footing where the ice pack sat differently against the base. Radial ice spread. I put on my gloves without realizing I was doing it, then stopped halfway to the hatch. The entry had been right. That was the moment Frostline stopped feeling isolated and started feeling targeted. By the time full dark settled in, I had read every active log on the system twice. Near the bottom of the archive index, I found a user profile I hadn't noticed in the handover packet. Marek Ilya Vostrikov, technician, archived winter oversight 3 years earlier. And the first log I opened from his run made the room feel colder. Door contact anomaly, south vestibule. Likely operator error, though operator does not believe so. Reverse impressions beyond east perimeter, no confirmed subject. Future notation in active log, system verified. Every line sat ahead of me by a handful of hours, like I was reading a transcript of my day before I'd finished living it. Marek wrote cleanly, tersely, with the same technical impatience I would have used. Not identical to me, but close enough that I understood why Ingrid's eyes had gone strange when she learned my name. I read deeper. He mentioned the hum that persisted during partial power down. He mentioned the tower sounding stressed without load change. He mentioned a habit of checking the wall clock until he no longer trusted whichever answer came second. At 9:16 that night, the internal clock over the radio flickered. I heard it before I saw it, a tiny electrical tick from the housing, then another. The digits blurred, steadied on 9:16, then flashed to 3:12 for less than a second before returning. I got up so fast I knocked my pen off the desk. The workstation still read 9:16. My watch read 9:17. The backup tablet lagged by 2 seconds. The wall clock sat there mute and square above the radio console, as if it hadn't just slipped 5.5 hours ahead and back again. I checked the power feed, stable. Checked internal battery, stable. Checked event history. No fault logged. In Marek's archive, 4 hours ahead of my current time, there was an entry that read, "Clock flicker observed. Do not use the first time you see." I stood there with the printer paper in one hand and the cold station air drying the inside of my nose. And for the first time, I had the definite, unreasonable sense that someone had arranged the room around me before I entered it. I should have stopped then, waited for dawn, requested extraction. There are plenty of versions of this story where that would have been the rational move. But rational wasn't the same thing as honest, and I hadn't been as good at telling those apart as I thought. Years earlier, at another northern installation, I'd seen warning signs in a tower report and softened them. I told myself it was temporary, that the storm bracing would hold, that a shutdown would have been an overreaction, and that there were numbers to consider and careers to think about and no need to crater a contract over a problem that might not mature. The official record later called what happened weather-related failure. A younger tech died under a collapse pattern I'd already seen coming. Nobody ever proved what I'd done. I made sure of that. So when Frostline began handing me warnings in my own language, part of what kept me there was professional stubbornness, but part of it was older and uglier. I couldn't bear the thought that something in that station knew what I had buried and had chosen me because of it. Marek's last completed log before midnight ended with one line. If the tower alarm sounds at 2:43, the second one comes before the air changes. At 2:43 in the morning, the tower alarm sounded, and the sound went through the whole station, a hard rising pulse that bounced off the corridor walls and made the cutlery in the galley drawer chatter. I was already awake, sitting at the console with a mug going cold in my hands because sleep had become impossible once the clock started meaning more than the night. I checked the internal clock first, 2:43. Out loud because Ingrid had told me to. 2:43, I said to the empty room. The sound of my own voice bothered me more than it should have. The alarm continued. Not the full emergency wail, just the tower fault sequence. A cycling tone meant to send an operator out to visually confirm icing, structural sway, or transmitter casing damage. Under ordinary circumstances, it would have been routine. It was still before 3, the first alarm in the hour. By the posted rules, I was allowed to investigate. I geared up carefully. Outer layer zipped to the chin, face shield, heavy gloves, ice lamp, handheld radio. I remember how methodical I was because I wanted method to protect me from meaning. It was just a tower check, just a station with a corrupted archive and a supervisor who'd let isolation turn into ritual. When I opened the main hatch, the cold hit like a shove. The air burned all the way down, my eyelashes crisped with frost in seconds. Outside, the wind dragged powder across the path in shining sheets, hissing over the snow crust. The perimeter lights threw long, pale cones across the ground, and the tower beyond them leaned and straightened in the blowing white, a black-ribbed thing stitched with red beacons. I kept one eye on the station as I crossed to the tower, and that's standard practice out there. No one tells you that in the manuals, but every northern worker knows it. You never let the warm place leave your awareness. The closer I got, the louder the structure sounded, not failure, not yet. Just strain, that familiar metal complaint of cold, stiff members flexing under gust load. I circled the base, lamp beam moving over anchor bolts, rime buildup, cable tension points. The footing looked clean, no abnormal cracking, no ice uplift, sensor casing intact. I even crouched to check the north side where the future log had mentioned radial spread. Nothing. My breath fogged my face shield from the inside. The tower alarm stopped. I stood there another minute, listening. No more tone, no hidden movement. Only wind and the endless low hum that seemed to travel through the frozen ground from somewhere it shouldn't have. I put a gloved hand against one of the tower legs and felt vibration through the metal, fine and constant. The kind of thing you noticed and filed for later review. Routine complete, I headed back. That should have calmed me. Instead, it made everything worse, because the alarm had produced nothing, and empty procedures are more dangerous than active threats. They teach you to doubt the next real signal. I logged the inspection. No visible fault, no further action. Then I sat under the wall clock and watched minutes peel away. 3 o'clock came, then 3:05, then 3:10. The station changed at 3:12. I didn't understand it until later, but the first thing that vanished was the wind. In 1 second, Frostline was full of it. The metallic groan from the antenna structures, the dry hiss at the walls, the occasional hard rattle when a gust hit the service ladder. The next second, all of that was gone. Not faded. Gone. Silence in a remote station is never truly silent. There was still the hum under the floor, the fan motors, my own breathing. But without the wind, the building sounded exposed, as if some cover noise had been peeled off and whatever remained had been waiting underneath all along. Then the tower alarm sounded again. 312, second alarm in 1 hour. I was halfway out of my chair before I remembered the rule. Do not investigate the second alarm. I stayed where I was, not because I believed, because I had proof by then that the station's patterns existed whether I liked them or not, and because there is a point in any bad situation where even pride starts bargaining. The alarm cycled once, twice, stopped. The silence outside pressed harder. On the printer tray beside me, a fresh sheet began feeding through. No command from me, no status prompt. Just the soft, mechanical tug of rollers and the dry spit of warm paper into cold air. I took the page when it settled. Do not respond to the second alarm, logged and verified. Below that, in the same clean block of text, another line appeared letter by letter while I watched. If you go out now, you'll find your own tracks. The sheet smelled hot and chemical in my hands. The room smelled suddenly impossibly, like wet insulation and bent steel after lightning strike. I hadn't smelled that in years, not since the morning the tower came down. And I wish I could tell you that was when I understood Frostline had chosen its method because of me. In truth, I understood and refused to say it to myself. That's how denial works when you've had practice. You don't disbelieve. You just keep translating the truth into safer language until it resembles something survivable. Data contamination, archive bleed, stress response, sensory association. Outside, in the absolute dead stillness between 312 and 313, something brushed the outer wall. Not scraped, brushed. Slow enough that I heard fabric or skin or some other soft surface moving over ice-encrusted steel. I did not look at the window. I kept staring at the internal clock while my hands went numb inside warm gloves. 313. The radio on the console clicked alive, and a burst of static washed through the speaker. Then a voice said very clearly, "I'm heading to the tower now." My voice, not close. Not live. Radio thinned, breathy from exertion, but mine all the same. I had not spoken. Every muscle in my back locked at once. The radio hissed softly after the transmission, still open, waiting. I could hear a second layer under the static, like another signal almost lined up behind the first. If you hear your own voice on the radio, do not answer. I didn't. I couldn't. The speaker clicked again. This time the voice came lower, tighter, as if spoken through clenched teeth. Base looks stable, no action required. That sentence wasn't in any Frostline procedure. It was from my report. Not word for word, but close enough that the room seemed to tilt around me. Stable, no action required. And the neat little lie I'd built my life on, dressed up in professional language and signed under my own hand, while a junior technician trusted I knew what I was doing. I stood there in the station at 3:14 in the morning with my own voice feeding my buried sentence back to me. And I knew, finally, that whatever was outside had not found a random man in a remote post. It had found me. I should have locked myself in the innermost room and waited for daylight. Instead, at 3:15, I put on my gloves again and opened the hatch. I wish I could dress that up as bravery. It wasn't, not entirely. Part of it was the same defect that had ruined me before, the certainty that I could still get ahead of a pattern if I moved quickly enough and named things properly enough. Part of it was something else too, something meaner. I wanted to see what knew me. The cold outside felt heavier than before, as if the air had thickened. It burned the inside of my nose so sharply my eyes watered at once. No wind, not even a surface drift. The whole station yard lay under the perimeter lights in a stillness so complete it looked staged. And there, leading away from the main hatch before my first step landed, were my boot prints. They started at the threshold. My boots were still on the raised grate of the entry platform. The prints led across the path in the shallow outward angle I always used when heading for the tower, Right foot slightly wider, left heel cutting harder because of an old ankle tweak from a site in Greenland. I knew those details because fieldwork made you know your own movement. The same way years around equipment made you know which vibration was harmless and which one was a warning. I stood frozen on the threshold and looked down at a line of tracks I had not yet made, already pressed into the snow. The radio in my chest pocket crackled. My voice again, very close this time. "Don't follow them." A beat. Then from the same speaker and the same throat I hadn't used, another sentence came through. "Too late." I don't remember stepping off the platform. I remember only the sound. That dry, compact crunch as my real boots entered the path of the false ones and matched them perfectly. Soul to soul, edge to edge, I followed because not following would have meant standing there forever. The prince led toward the tower. Every 10 or 15 feet I checked over my shoulder. And the station windows threw pale rectangles across the snow. Beyond them, nothing moved. Yet I couldn't shake the sensation that my pace had a second rhythm half a step behind it, one that paused when I paused and resumed before I did. At the tower base, the footprints stopped, not turned, not wandered, ended. The last impression sat less than a foot from the north footing. Toes pointed inward, as if whoever had made it had come to attention and been lifted straight up out of the world. The tower above me creaked softly. Red obstruction lights pulsed down the lattice. The electrical hum I'd heard under the station floor seemed stronger here, rising through the ice itself. Then I heard breathing. Not mine, behind me. Controlled, shallow, someone trying not to be heard in cold air that betrayed every exhale. I turned, and nothing stood there. Only the path back to the station and the pale perimeter lights and the empty place where snow should have been moving but wasn't. Yet the feeling of another presence remained so specifically placed that my eyes kept returning to the same patch of air at shoulder height, as if some part of me could mark an outline the rest couldn't. On the radio, my voice whispered, "Check the clock." Back inside, I went straight to the wall unit. 316. The digits flickered once and became 314, then 316 again. On the archive screen, Marek's logs had advanced. My latest action, exiting after the second alarm, already sat recorded in a line I had not typed. Below it was an audio attachment I hadn't seen before. Final advisory. My hands were shaking by then, not from panic exactly, but from a kind of physical revulsion, as if my body had begun understanding contamination before my mind did. I clicked the file. Static came first. Then a man's voice, tired and careful. "If you're listening to this, I've lost the interval. The clocks aren't wrong, they're layered. You think you're ahead because you can still read yourself in the logs, but that's only until it catches your phrasing. Once it starts using your voice, you're already inside its timing. Marek." I knew that from the accent, from the cadence, from the way he flattened certain consonants when concentrating. He kept going. "The rules don't save you. Or maybe they do." I couldn't tell anymore whether we were hiding from it or doing what it wanted. If the second alarm sounds, and it will, you have two choices. Stay inside and let the hour close, or go out and break the sequence yourself. Paper rustled in the recording, his breathing hitched. In the background, I heard the tower alarm start. Then his voice changed. It happened gradually enough that for a second I thought it was interference, a drift in pitch, a radio artifact. But by the middle of the next sentence, the vowels had shifted, the consonants had sharpened, and Marek's voice was becoming mine. "If you stay inside," the recording said in my own voice, "you live long enough to take the shift." A burst of static. Then still in my voice, a sentence I had not yet spoken. "If you go out, you might die where the pattern wants you." The file ended. I sat there listening to the empty speaker hiss. That was the moment Marek stopped being a predecessor and became something worse, a mirror passed down the line, in not a warning from the past, a proof of what the station did with someone who lasted long enough to understand it. 3:16, according to the wall clock. 3:13, according to the workstation. 3:17, briefly, in the black reflection of the darkened microwave door across the room. The countdown had stopped feeling linear. Time wasn't marching anymore. It was aligning. That left me with the choice. Stay inside. Lock every door. Do not answer the radio. Do not look beyond the lights. Let the tower alarm, if it came again, go unanswered until the hour closed. That was what the rules demanded, and based on everything Frostline had shown me, it probably would have worked, at least in the narrow practical sense. My body would have survived the night. But then what? I had Marek's voice on file turning into mine. I had logs written in my phrasing before I acted. I had my own future movements pressed into the snow. Survival inside the station no longer meant escape. It meant accession. It meant becoming another advisory voice in the walls, another set of rules for the next man dropped into the cold. Maybe that was all Marek had done. Maybe he had obeyed long enough to remain useful. The other option was to intervene. Go outside at the hour the station wanted. Step into whatever pattern had been built for me. Risk the full collapse sequence. Risk death. I wish there'd been a clean moral answer. There wasn't, because staying inside would have meant finally doing the safe thing, the procedural thing, the thing every training manual would advise in an incomprehensible event. And going out would have meant repeating my oldest failure, a choosing action because I couldn't bear helplessness, because I needed to prove I still had agency even when the system around me was bigger than me. I thought about the junior tech at the old tower. Not his face. I still hated myself for how often memory spared me that. What I remembered was his trust. The way he stood at the base looking up while I stood by the truck reviewing the report on a clipboard. The way he didn't question my sign-off because competence was a thing you borrowed from the man above you until you had enough of your own. Years later, at Frostline, I realized the lie that had destroyed me wasn't the report language. It was the belief that doing nothing and calling it judgment made me less responsible than acting. The radio clicked, my voice very soft. Giancallum. No one had said my name inside that station except Ingrid. Then the same voice said, "You left him there." I closed my eyes. When I opened them, the wall clock read 3:17. The tower alarm began. I was outside before the second pulse finished. Not running, not exactly, but moving with the locked, deliberate speed people use when they're trying not to let fear choose their balance. The air cut straight through the gap at my collar, each breath seared. The station door slammed behind me and the sound vanished into the huge, dead stillness of the yard. The tower stood ahead under the red obstruction lamps. The ground around it looked ordinary for half a second. Then the first crack shot through the ice. It made a sharp report like a board snapping deep underground. A line opened at the north footing and raced outward, branching cleanly into a radial spread. Another followed, then another. Within 2 breaths, the entire base was ringed by those perfect spoke-like fractures, the same structural expression I'd seen years earlier under Stormload. The same widening geometry I'd reviewed in photographs and then buried beneath softer words. Stable pattern, no immediate action. The tower did not fall. That made it worse, because the sound came anyway. A long metallic shriek of torsion and failing members, exact in pitch and progression to the collapse I had caused, echoing upward through the black lattice and outward across the frozen plain. Every hair on my body rose under my layers. I could smell hot metal, though the air was far too cold for it, and beneath that wet concrete dust, a smell memory dragged up from under years of denial. I reached the outer ring of cracks and stopped. Behind me, a footstep pressed into the snow. One step, human weight, close, then another matching the stride I hadn't yet taken. I knew with the clean certainty that sometimes comes in terror, that if I turned too fast I would see either nothing or exactly what I deserved, and I wasn't sure which was worse. So I did the only honest thing I had left. I took the handheld recorder from my chest pocket, thumbed it on, and started talking into the freezing air while the tower screamed above me. "My name is Callum Reed Halverson," I said, and my voice shook only once. "I falsified a structural safety report on a northern radar tower. I knew the base stress pattern wasn't stable. I signed it off anyway to avoid a shutdown. And the collapse killed my junior technician. The official record was a lie." The sound of the tower failure went on and on. Impossible now, too long for any real event. I wrote that it was weather-related. It wasn't. It was me. The footstep behind me stopped. For one instant, everything became so still I could hear frost crystals ticking off the tower legs. Then a voice, right behind my shoulder and using my exact cadence, said, "Confirmed." I turned. At first I thought I was looking at a gap in the air, a section of darkness that didn't belong to the rest. Then the perimeter light shifted and something like a figure resolved, built out of absence. A man-shaped distortion with frost gathering along edges that weren't edges. It stood in my posture, head tilted the way I tilted mine when assessing load. Its boots sat in the snow exactly where my next step would have landed. No face, not really. Only a suggestion of features, as if someone had drawn me from memory after years of trying not to think about me. It took one step closer. The ice at my feet answered with a new crack. That was the moral center of the whole night, though I didn't have language for it then. If I backed away and ran for the station, I might still reach shelter. I might still get to dawn. But I would be doing what I'd done before, preserving myself first and leaving the consequence for someone else's body, someone else's shift, someone else's hour. If I held ground, the cracks might widen. The tower might complete what it had been imitating. I might die in the exact pattern I had once escaped through paperwork. There wasn't a right answer. I'd only a more honest one. So I stayed. Not forever. I'm not making a hero out of myself, but for those few seconds at the ring of fractures with the cold carving my lungs and the thing in my shape standing within arm's reach, I did not retreat. I lifted the recorder and said it again, louder, forcing the words over the impossible metal shriek. I signed it, I knew. He died because I wanted the site to stay open. The figure didn't lunge, didn't strike. It leaned in just enough that I heard my own breathing coming from outside my body, matched to mine, but half a beat late. Then the tower noise stopped. Not faded, stopped. The sudden silence hit harder than the alarm had. My ears rang. Somewhere behind me in the station, the printer started feeding paper. The figure's outline shivered. A frost climbed its shoulders in fine white veins. I thought for one wild second that confession had broken it, that naming the thing had altered the pattern. Then it stepped past me toward the station with my gait, my height, my right shoulder dipping a fraction lower from an old field injury. That was when I ran. I don't remember deciding. My body did it for me. I tore back across the path, boots slamming into the shallow impressions already waiting for them. The station door felt impossibly far. My breath rasped hot against the inside of my face shield. Behind me, I heard nothing at all, which was worse than pursuit. I hit the hatch, fumbled the handle once with numb gloves, got inside, and slammed the lock. The hum in the station had changed, stronger now. Nearer, as if the walls themselves were carrying current. E-printer paper lay curled in the tray. One line. Supervisor confirmed. Replacement complete. I stared at it until the letters blurred, then looked up at the window above the console. Outside, under the perimeter lights, another figure stood where I had stood moments earlier near the tower ring. motionless, head slightly bowed, watching the station, watching me. It stayed there until dawn grayed the horizon. I didn't sleep. I don't think I blinked much either. The hours after 3:17 passed in fragments, all of them thin and hard. I locked every door twice, then again. I killed non-essential power to test the hum and heard it continue under the floor. I replayed the recorder where I'd confessed and found my own voice there. But under the last sentence, another voice breathed the same words a fraction late. At 4:10, the wall clock corrected itself and never flickered again. At 5:20, the figure outside was gone. At 6, the outpost frequency crackled with a routine weather check I almost answered before remembering to verify the clock first. Dawn in the Arctic wasn't warm. It just made the darkness less absolute. A colorless strip opened at the horizon, enough to put edges back on the snow. I called for evacuation on the grounds of systems anomaly and operator compromise. I kept it dry and procedural. Learned habits die hard. The aircraft arrived just after 8, skis whispering over the packed strip east of the station. By then, the tower stood exactly as it had on arrival, no sign of collapse, no fresh damage visible from the windows. The ring of fractures at the base had vanished under drift. If not for the recorder, and the printout, and the fact that I could no longer trust my own reflection when it appeared in dark glass a beat later than it should have, I might have convinced myself the worst parts had been sleep deprivation layered over guilt. I did not look back at the station until I was strapped into the aircraft. The cabin smelled of fuel, thawing canvas, and the stale wool of parkas that had soaked up too many winters. The heater coughed lukewarm air at my boots. My fingers had gone beyond pain into stiffness, and I kept flexing them because the joints felt subtly wrong, as if my hands had memorized some other timing during the night and were still trying to return to it. Below us, Frostline shrank into white. The pilot was a compact man with a trimmed beard gone silver at the chin. We'd met only in passing on the inbound run, and he handled the aircraft with easy concentration, gloved hand light on the controls. For the first 20 minutes, he said nothing beyond standard check phrases. I was grateful for that. My whole body felt scraped hollow. Then he glanced back over his shoulder and said, "You all right back there, Marek?" The cabin heater was on, but the inside of my nose burned with sudden cold. I didn't answer. Maybe he had misspoken. Maybe I had misheard through engine noise. I told myself that while he turned back to the windscreen and the plane droned south over endless white, I told myself that until he reached for the clipboard clipped beside his seat, frowned at it, and muttered almost to himself, "Strange." I leaned forward enough to see the top page. Flight log, passenger manifest, time of departure. Under occupant status, it listed one living passenger, Marek Ilya Vostrikov. Below that, in smaller printed text that looked exactly like Frostline's station output, was another line. Callum Reed Halverson, deceased at 3:17. I sat back very carefully after that. I didn't make a scene. I didn't lunge for the clipboard. There was nowhere useful to go at that altitude, and some part of me already understood that arguing with a printed record had never saved me before. I just folded my hands over the straps across my lap and listened. The engine gave its steady drone. The pilot breathed through his nose. And under both of those, faint but constant, I heard the same low electrical hum I'd first felt in Frostline's floor, still running somewhere beneath me, though an aircraft cabin had no reason to sound like that. And I kept my eyes on the window until we crossed the coast and the world below stopped looking like a blank page. Since that flight, I checked clocks before I answered phones, before I opened doors, before I spoke into any radio or intercom. I stopped writing the word stable in reports. I stopped softening findings to protect schedules. I stopped trusting reflections that didn't quite settle when I did. Those were the obvious changes. The other one was smaller. Every day at 3:17, wherever I am, I felt the skin between my shoulders tighten as if someone had just stepped into a footprint behind me.